Welcome to Weekly Marx. 5th of April. We're looking on Saturdays for a while now. We're going to be looking at theories of surplus value. Today will be chapters 1 and 2. I'm going to try and do this a different way. That is, we'll run the audio because it is available as a full audio book on YouTube. Try and run that and then run the text alongside it. And hopefully I will be able to make some annotations in the chat. We'll see whether that works or not. May not, but it's worth a little experiment. The reason to look at theories of surplus value is because it's not so much a later text as it has been always sort of shunted to the side, disclaimed as volume 4 of Capital. And one can argue that that's for good reason. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that it has been attended to as volume 4 for quite a while, and not to assert its presence as volume 4 so much as it is worth sort of considering that Marx didn't forget about it in the context of writing Capital, and he tried to make it sort of the accompaniment, a kind of history, as it were. But it's more than that, and because also that he's incorporated parts of it in the first 3 volumes, and I think that there are other issues that probably need to be worked out that aren't just simply disclaiming it as a product of Soviet librarians or German librarians or whatever. So we'll get started here and see how this is going to trundle along. Theories of Surplus Value, chapters 1 and 2 by Karl Marx. The first paragraph here, or the little general observation, is not included in the text. All economists share the error of examining surplus value not as such in its pure form, but in the particular forms of profit and rent. What theoretical errors must necessarily arise from this will be shown more fully in Chapter 3 in the analysis of the greatly changed form which surplus value assumes as profit.
Theories of Surplus Value by Karl Marx. This independent recording by Andrew S. Reitenberg is public domain, both in content and in audio. Part 1. Chapter 1. Sir James Stewart. Distinction between profit upon alienation and the positive increase of wealth. Before the physiocrats, surplus value, that is, profit in the form of profit, was explained purely from exchange, from the sale of the commodity above its value. Sir James Stewart, on the whole, did not get beyond this restricted view. He must rather be regarded as the man who reproduced it in scientific form. I say in scientific form, for Stewart does not share the illusion that the surplus value which accrues to the individual capitalist from selling the commodity above its value is a creation of new wealth. He distinguishes, therefore, between positive profit and relative profit. Quote, positive profit implies no loss to anybody. It results from an augmentation of labor, industry, or ingenuity, and has the effect of swelling or augmenting the public good. Relative profit is what implies a loss to somebody. It marks a vibration of the balance of wealth between parties, but implies no addition to the general stock. The compound is easily understood. It is that species of profit which is partly relative and partly positive. Both kinds may subsist inseparably in the same transaction. End quote from James Stewart. Positive profit arises from an augmentation of labor, industry, and ingenuity. How it arises from this, Stewart makes no attempt to explain. The further statement that the effect of this profit is to augment and swell the public good seems to indicate that Stewart means by it nothing but the greater mass of use values produced in consequence of the development of the productive powers of labor, and that he thinks of this positive profit as quite distinct from capitalist profit, which always presupposes an increase of exchange value. This interpretation is fully confirmed by his further exposition. He says, to wit, quote, "In the price of goods, I consider two things as really existing, and quite different from one another, the real value of the commodity and the profit upon alienation." End quote. The price of goods therefore comprises two elements that are completely different from each other. Firstly, their real value, and secondly, the profit upon alienation, the profit realized through their transfer to another person, their sale. This profit upon alienation therefore arises from the price of goods being greater than their real value, or from the goods being sold above their value. Gain on the one side therefore always involves a loss on the other. No addition to the general stock is created. Profit, that is surplus value, is relative and resolves itself into, quote, "a vibration of the balance of wealth between parties," end quote. Stuart himself rejects the idea that surplus value can be explained in this way. His theory of a vibration of the balance of wealth between parties, however little it touches the nature and origin of surplus value itself, remains important in considering the distribution of surplus value among different classes and among different categories such as profit, interest, and rent. That Stuart limits all profit of the individual capitalist to this relative profit, profit upon alienation, is shown by the following. The real value, he says, is determined by the quantity of labor, which, quote, "upon an average, a workman of the country in general may perform in a day, a week, or a month," end quote. Secondly, quote, "the value of the workman's subsistence and necessary expense, both for supplying his personal wants and the instruments belonging to his profession, which must be taken upon the average as above," end quote. Thirdly, quote, "the values of the materials. These three articles being known, the price of manufacture is determined. It cannot be lower than the amount of all the three, that is, than the real value. Whatever is higher is the manufacturer's profit. This will be in proportion to demand, and therefore will fluctuate according to circumstances. Hence appears the necessity of a great demand in order to promote flourishing manufactures. The industrious regulate their living and expense according to their certain profit," end quote. From this, it is clear that the profit of the manufacturer, of the individual capitalist, is always relative profit, always profit upon alienation, always derived from the excess of the price of the commodity over its real value, from its sale above its value. If, therefore, all commodities were sold at their value, no profit would exist. Stuart wrote a special chapter on this. He examines in detail, quote, "how profits consolidate into prime cost," end quote. Stuart, on the one hand, rejects the conception of the monetary and mercantile systems, according to which the sale of commodities above their value and the profit resulting therefrom creates surplus value, a positive increase of wealth. On the other hand, he holds to their view that the profit of the individual capital is nothing but this excess of the price over the value, the profit upon alienation. This, however, according to him, is only relative, the gain on the one side being compensated by the loss on the other, and consequently this movement is nothing more than, quote, "a vibration of the balance of wealth between parties," end quote. In this respect, Stuart is therefore the rational expression of the monetary and mercantile systems. His service to the theory of capital is that he shows how the process of separation takes place between the conditions of production as the property of a definite class and labor power. He gives a great deal of attention to this genesis of capital, without as yet seeing it directly as the genesis of capital, although he sees it as a condition for large-scale industry. He examines the process, particularly in agriculture, and he rightly considers that manufacturing industry proper only came into being through this process of separation in agriculture. In Adam Smith's writings, this process of separation is assumed to be already completed. Chapter 2. The Physiocrats. Section 1. Transfer of the inquiry into the origin of surplus value from the sphere of circulation into the sphere of direct production. Conception of rent as the sole form of surplus value. The analysis of capital within the bourgeois horizon is essentially the work of the physiocrats. It is this service that makes them the true fathers of modern political economy. In the first place, the analysis of the various material components in which capital exists and into which it resolves itself in the course of the labor process. It is not a reproach to the physiocrats that, like all their successors, they thought of these material forms of existence, such as tools, raw machines, etc., as capital, in isolation from the social conditions in which they appear in capitalist production. In a word, in the form in which they are the elements of the labor process in general, independently of its social form, and thereby made of the capitalist form of production an eternal, natural form of production. For them, the bourgeois forms of production necessarily appeared as natural forms. It was their great merit that they conceived these forms as physiological forms of society, as forms arising from the natural necessity of production itself, forms that are independent of anyone's will or of politics, etc. They are material laws. The error is only that the material law of a definite historical social stage is conceived as an abstract law governing equally all forms of society. In addition to this analysis of the material elements of which capital consists within the labor process, the physiocrats establish the forms which capital assumes in circulation: fixed capital, circulating capital, even though as yet they give them other names, and in general, the connection between the process of circulation and the reproduction process of capital. We will come back to this in the chapter on circulation. In these two principal points, Adam Smith inherited the legacy of the physiocrats. His service, in this connection, is limited to fixing the abstract categories, to the greater consistency of the baptismal names which he gave the distinctions made by the physiocrats in their analysis. As we have seen, the basis for the development of capitalist production is in general that labor power, as the commodity belonging to the workers, confronts the conditions of labor as commodities maintained in the form of capital and existing independently of the workers. The determination of the value of labor power as a commodity is of vital importance. This value is equal to the labor time required to produce the means of subsistence necessary for the reproduction of labor power, or to the price of the means of subsistence necessary for the existence of the worker as a worker. It is only on this basis that the difference arises between the value of labor power and the value which that labor power creates, a difference which exists with no other commodity, since there is no other commodity whose use value, and therefore also the use of it, can increase its exchange value, or the exchange values resulting from it. Therefore, the foundation of modern political economy, whose business is the analysis of capitalist production, is the conception of the value of labor power as something fixed, as a given magnitude, as indeed it is in practice in each particular case. The minimum of wages, therefore, correctly forms the pivotal point of physiocratic theory. They were able to establish this, although they had not yet recognized the nature of value itself, because this value of labor power is manifested in the price of the necessary means of subsistence, hence in a sum of definite use values. Consequently, without being in any way clear as to the nature of value, they could conceive the value of labor power, so far as it was necessary to their inquiry, as a definite magnitude. If, moreover, they made the mistake of conceiving this minimum as an unchangeable magnitude, which, in their view, is determined entirely by nature and not by the stage of historical development, which is itself a magnitude subject to fluctuations, this in no way affects the abstract correctness of their conclusions, since the difference between the value of labor power and the value it creates does not at all depend on whether the value is assumed to be great or small. The physiocrats transferred the inquiry into the origin of surplus value from the sphere of circulation into the sphere of direct production, and thereby laid the foundation for the analysis of capitalist production. Quite correctly, they laid down the fundamental principle that only that labor is productive which creates a surplus value, in whose product, therefore, a higher value is contained than the sum of the values consumed during the production of this product. Since the value of raw and other materials is given, while the value of the labor power is equal to the minimum of wages, this surplus value can clearly only consist in the excess of labor which the laborer returns to the capitalist over and above the quantity of labor that he receives in his wage. But it does not appear in this form with the physiocrats, because they had not yet reduced value in general to its simple substance, the quantity of labor, or labor time. Their method of exposition is of course necessarily governed by their general view of the nature of value, which to them is not a definite social mode of existence of human activity, labor, but consists of material things, land, nature, and the various modifications of these material things. The difference between the value of labor power and the value created by it, that is, the surplus value which the purchase of labor power secures for the user of labor power, appears most palpably, most incontrovertibly, of all branches of production in agriculture, the primary branch of production. The sum total of the means of subsistence which the laborer consumes from one year to another, or the mass of material substance which he consumes, is smaller than the sum total of the means of subsistence which he produces. In manufacture, the workman is not generally seen directly producing either his means of subsistence or the surplus in excess of his means of subsistence. The process is mediated through purchase and sale, through the various acts of circulation, and the analysis of value in general is necessary for it to be understood. In agriculture, it shows itself directly in the surplus of use values produced over use values consumed by the laborer, and can therefore be grasped without an analysis of value in general, without a clear understanding of the nature of value. Therefore, also when value is reduced to use value, and the latter to material substance in general. Hence, for the physiocrats, agricultural labor is the only productive labor, because it is the only labor that produces a surplus value, and rent is the only form of surplus value which they know. The workman in industry does not increase the material substance, he only alters its form. The material, the mass of material substance, is given to him by agriculture. It is true that he adds value to the substance, not through his labor, but through the cost of production of his labor, through the total means of subsistence which he consumes during his labor, equivalent to the minimum of wages which he receives from agriculture. Because agricultural labor is conceived as the only productive labor, the form of surplus value which distinguishes agricultural labor from industrial labor, rent, is conceived as the only form of surplus value. Profit on capital in the true sense, of which rent itself is only an offshoot, therefore does not exist for the physiocrats. Profit is seen by them as only a kind of higher wages paid by the landowners, which the capitalists consume as revenue, and which therefore enters into their cost of production in the same way as the minimum wages of the ordinary workman. This increases the value of the raw material, because it enters into the consumption cost which the capitalist, the industrialist, consumes while he is producing the product, transforming the raw material into a new product. Surplus value in the form of interest on money, another branch of profit, is consequently declared by one section of the physiocrats, such as Mirabeau the Elder, to be usury and contrary to nature. Turgot, on the other hand, derives his justification of it from the fact that the money capitalist could buy land, that is, rent, and that therefore his money capital must bring him in as much surplus value as he would receive if he converted it into landed property. This means, therefore, that interest too is not newly created value, not surplus value. It only explains why a part of the surplus value gained by the landowners finds its way to the money capitalists in the form of interest, just as it is explained on other grounds why a part of this surplus value finds its way to the industrial capitalist in the form of profit. Because agricultural labor is the only productive labor, the only labor that creates surplus value, the form of surplus value which distinguishes agricultural labor from all other branches of labor, that is rent, is the general form of surplus value. Industrial profit and interest are merely different categories into which rent is divided, and in certain portions passes from the hands of the landowners into the hands of other classes. This is the direct opposite to the view held by later economists, beginning with Adam Smith, because they rightly consider industrial profit to be the form in which surplus value is originally appropriated by capital, hence as the original general form of surplus value. They present interest and rent as mere offshoots of industrial profit, which is distributed by the industrial capitalist to various classes, who are co-owners of surplus value. In addition to the reason already stated, that agricultural labor is the labor in which the creation of surplus value appears in material and tangible form, and apart from the process of circulation, there were a number of other considerations which explain the standpoint of the physiocrats. First, because in agriculture, rent appears as a third element, as a form of surplus value which is not found in industry, or merely has a transient existence. It was surplus value over and above surplus value, that is profit, and so the most palpable and most conspicuous form of surplus value raised to the second power. By means of agriculture, as Karl Arndt, the homebred economist, says, a value is created in the rent of land, which is not to be met with in industry and trade, a value which remains over when the labor and capital employed have been completely replaced. Secondly, leaving foreign trade out of account, as the physiocrats rightly did and had to do in an abstract study of bourgeois society, it is clear that the number of workmen engaged in manufacture, etc., and completely detached from agriculture, the free hands, as Stuart calls them, is determined by the mass of agricultural products which the farm laborers produce in excess of their own consumption. Quote, "It is obvious that the relative numbers of those persons who can be maintained without agricultural labor must be measured wholly by the productive powers of the cultivators." End quote from Richard Jones on the Distribution of Wealth, published in London in 1831. As agricultural labor thus forms the natural basis not only for surplus labor in its own sphere, but also for the independent existence of all other branches of labor, and therefore also for the surplus value created in them, it is clear that it was bound to be considered the creator of surplus value, so long as the substance of value was regarded as a definite, concrete labor, and not abstract labor with its measure, labor time. Thirdly, all surplus value, not only relative but absolute, depends on a given productivity of labor. If the productivity of labor had reached only such a stage of development that a man's labor time no more than sufficed to keep him alive, to produce and reproduce his own means of subsistence, then there would be no surplus labor and no surplus value, and there would be no difference at all between the value of labor power and the value which it creates. The possibility of surplus labor and of surplus value therefore arises from a given productivity of labor, a productivity which enables labor power to create more than its own value, to produce more than the needs dictated by its life process. And indeed, this productivity, this level of productivity which is presupposed as the starting point, must first, as we saw in the second point above, make its appearance in agricultural labor. It appears, therefore, as a gift of nature, a productive power of nature. Here, in agriculture, from the very beginning, there is a large measure of cooperation of the forces of nature, the increase of human labor power through the use and exploitation of the forces of nature working automatically. This utilization of the forces of nature on a large scale appears in manufacture only with the development of large-scale industry. A definite stage in the development of agriculture, whether in the country concerned or in other countries, forms the basis for the development of capital. Up to this point, absolute surplus value coincides with relative. Buchanan, a great adversary of the physiocrats, makes this point even against Adam Smith when he tries to show that agricultural development preceded the emergence of modern town industry. Fourthly, since it is the great and specific contribution of the physiocrats that they derive value and surplus value not from circulation but from production, they necessarily begin, in contrast to the monetary and mercantile system, with that branch of production which can be thought of in complete separation from and independently of circulation, of exchange, and which presupposes exchange not between man and man, but only between man and nature. Section 2. Contradictions in the system of the physiocrats, the feudal shell of the system, and its bourgeois essence, the twofold treatment of surplus value. Hence the contradictions in the physiocratic system. It is in fact the first system which analyzes capitalist production and presents the conditions within which capital is produced and within which capital produces as eternal laws of production. On the other hand, it has rather the character of a bourgeois reproduction of the feudal system, of the dominion of landed property, and the industrial spheres within which capital first develops independently are presented as unproductive branches of labor, mere appendages of agriculture. The first condition for the development of capital is the separation of landed property from labor, the emergence of land, the primary condition of labor, as an independent force, a force in the hands of a separate class, confronting the free laborer. The physiocrats therefore present the landowner as the true capitalist, that is, the appropriator of surplus labor. Feudalism is thus portrayed and explained from the viewpoint of bourgeois production. Agriculture is treated as the branch of production in which capitalist production, that is, the production of surplus value, exclusively appears. While feudalism is thus made bourgeois, bourgeois society is given a feudal semblance. This semblance deceived Dr. Quesnay's adherents among the nobility, such as the crotchety and patriarchal Mirabeau the Elder. Among the later representatives of the physiocrats, especially Turgot, this illusion disappears completely, and the physiocratic system is presented as the new capitalist society prevailing within the framework of feudal society. This therefore corresponds to bourgeois society in the epoch when the latter breaks its way out of the feudal order. Consequently, the starting point is in France, in a predominantly agricultural country, and not in England, a predominantly industrial, commercial, and seafaring country. In the latter country, attention was naturally concentrated on circulation, on the fact that the product acquires value, becomes a commodity only when it becomes the expression of general social labor, money. Insofar, therefore, as the question concerned not the form of value, but the amount of value and the increase of value, profit upon expropriation, that is, relative profit as Stewart describes it, is what catches the eye. But if the creation of surplus value in the sphere of production itself is what has to be established, it is necessary, first of all, to go back to that branch of production in which surplus value is found independently of circulation, that is, in agriculture. The initiative was therefore taken in a predominantly agricultural country. Ideas related to those of the physiocrats are to be found in fragmentary form in older writers who preceded them, partly in France herself, for example, Bois-Guilbert. But it is only with the physiocrats that those ideas develop into an epoch-making system. The agricultural laborer, depending on the minimum of wages, the bare necessities, reproduces more than this bare necessity, and this more is rent, surplus value, which is appropriated by the owners of the fundamental condition of labor, nature. So what they say is not the laborer works more than the labor time required for the reproduction of his labor power. The value which he creates is therefore greater than the value of his labor power, or the labor which he gives in return is greater than the quantity of labor which he receives in the form of wages. But what they say is the amount of use values which he consumes during the period of production is smaller than the amount of use values which he creates, and so a surplus of use values is left over. Were he to work only for the time required to reproduce his own labor power, there would be nothing left over. But the physiocrats only stuck to the point that the productivity of the earth enables the laborer, in his day's labor, which is assumed to be a fixed quantity, to produce more than he needs to consume in order to continue to exist. The surplus value appears, therefore, as a gift of nature, through whose cooperation a definite quantity of organic matter, plant seeds, a number of animals, enables labor to transform more inorganic matter into organic. On the other hand, it is taken for granted that the landowner confronts the laborer as a capitalist. He pays for the labor power, which the laborer offers to him as a commodity, and he receives in return not only an equivalent, but appropriates for himself the enlarged value arising from the use of this labor power. The alienation of the material condition of labor from labor power itself is presupposed in this exchange. The starting point is the feudal landowner, but he comes onto the stage as a capitalist, as a mere owner of commodities, who makes profitable use of the goods exchanged by him for labor, and gets back not only their equivalent, but a surplus over this equivalent, because he pays for the labor power only as a commodity. He confronts the free laborer as an owner of commodities. In other words, this landowner is in essence a capitalist. In this respect too, the physiocratic system hits the mark, inasmuch as the separation of the laborer from the soil and from the ownership of land is a fundamental condition for capitalist production and the production of capital. Hence the contradictions in this system. It was the first to explain surplus value by the appropriation of the labor of others, and in fact to explain this appropriation on the basis of the exchange of commodities, but it did not see that value in general is a form of social labor, and that surplus value is surplus labor. On the contrary, it conceived value merely as use value, merely as material substance, and surplus value as a mere gift of nature, which returns to labor, in place of a given quantity of organic material, a greater quantity. On the one hand, it stripped rent, that is the true economic form of landed property, of its feudal wrapping, and reduced it to mere surplus value in the excess of the laborer's wage. On the other hand, this surplus value is explained again in a feudal way, as derived from nature and not from society, from man's relation to the soil, not from his social relations. Value itself is resolved into mere use value, and therefore into material substance. But again, what interests the physiocrats in this material substance is its quantity, the excess of the use values produced over those consumed. That is, the purely quantitative relation of the use values to each other, their mere exchange value, which, in the last resort, comes down to labor time. All these are contradictions of capitalist production as it works its way out of feudal society, and interprets feudal society itself only in a bourgeois way, but has not yet discovered its own peculiar form, somewhat as philosophy first builds itself up within the religious form of consciousness, and in so doing, on the one hand, destroys religion as such, while on the other hand, in its positive content, it still moves only within this religious sphere, idealized and reduced to terms of thought. Hence also, in the conclusions which the physiocrats themselves draw, the ostensible veneration of landed property becomes transformed into the economic negation of it and the affirmation of capitalist production. On the one hand, all taxes are put on rent, or, in other words, landed property is in part confiscated, which is what the legislation of the French Revolution sought to carry through, and which is the final conclusion of the fully developed Ricardian modern political economy. By placing the burden of tax entirely on rent, because it alone is surplus value, and consequently any taxation of other forms of income ultimately falls on landed property, but in a roundabout way, and therefore in an economically harmful way that hinders production, taxation, and along with it all forms of state intervention, are removed from industry itself, and the latter is thus freed from all intervention by the state. This is ostensibly done for the benefit of landed property, not in the interests of industry, but in the interests of landed property. Connected with this is laissez-faire, laissez-aller, unhampered, free competition, the removal from industry of all interference by the state, monopolies, etc. Since industry, as the physiocrats see it, creates nothing, but only transforms values given it by agriculture into another form, since it adds no new value to them, but returns the value supplied to it, though in altered form, as an equivalent, it is naturally desirable that this process of transformation should proceed without interruptions and in the cheapest way. And this is only realized through free competition, by leaving capitalist production to its own devices. The emancipation of bourgeois society from the absolute monarchy set up on the ruins of feudal society thus takes place only in the interests of the feudal landowner transformed into a capitalist and bent solely on enrichment. The capitalists are only capitalists in the interests of the landowner, just as political economy in its later development would have them be capitalists only in the interests of the working class. It can be seen, therefore, how little the modern economists, such as Eugene Dare, who published the works of the physiocrats together with his prize essay on them, have understood the physiocrats when they treat their specific theories of the exclusive productivity of agricultural labor, of rent as the only surplus value, and of the landowner's preeminent status in the system of production, as if they had no connection and were only fortuitously associated with their proclamation of free competition, the principle of large-scale industry, of capitalist production. At the same time, it is understandable how the feudal semblance of this system, in the same way as the aristocratic tone of the Enlightenment, was bound to win a number of feudal lords as enthusiastic supporters and propagandists of a system which, in its essence, proclaimed the rise of the bourgeois system of production on the ruins of the feudal. Section 3. Quesnay on the three classes in society. Further development of physiocratic theory with Turgot. Elements of a deeper analysis of capitalist relations. We will now examine a number of passages, partly to elucidate and partly in support of the theses advanced above. With Quesnay himself, in the analysis of the tableau économique, the nation consists of three classes of citizens: the productive class, that is, agricultural laborers, the class of landowners, and the sterile class, all the citizens occupied with other services and with other labors than those of agriculture. Only the agricultural laborers, not the landowners, appear as a productive class, as a class which creates surplus value. The importance of this class of landowners, which is not sterile because it is the representative of surplus value, does not rest on its being the creator of surplus value, but exclusively on the fact that it appropriates surplus value. With Turgot, the physiocratic system is most fully developed. In some passages in his writings, the pure gift of nature is presented as surplus labor, and on the other hand, the necessity for the laborer to yield up what there is in excess of his necessary wage is explained by the separation of the laborer from the conditions of labor, and their confronting him as the property of a class which uses them to trade with. The first reason why agricultural labor alone is productive is that it is the natural basis and precondition for the independent pursuit of all other forms of labor. Quote, his, that is the husbandman's, labor, in the sequence of the labors divided among the different members of society, retains the same primacy as the labor which provided his own food had among the different kinds of labor which, when he worked alone, he was obliged to devote to his different kinds of wants. We have here neither a primacy of honor nor of dignity. It is one of physical necessity. What his labor causes the land to produce beyond his personal wants is the only fund for the wages which all the other members of the society receive in exchange for their labor. The latter, in making use of the price of this exchange to buy in their turn the products of the husbandman, only return to him exactly what they have received from him. We have here a very essential difference between these two kinds of labor. End quote from Turgot. How then does surplus value arise? It does not arise from circulation, but is realized in circulation. The product is sold at its value, not above its value. There is no excess of price over value. But because it is sold at its value, the seller realizes a surplus value. This is only possible because he has not himself paid in full for the value which he sells. That is, because the product contains a portion of value which has not been paid for by the seller, which he has not offset by an equivalent. And this is the case with agricultural labor. The seller sells what he has not bought. Turgot at first presents this unbought element as a pure gift of nature. We shall see, however, that in his writings this pure gift of nature becomes imperceptibly transformed into the surplus labor of the laborer which the landowner has not bought, but which he sells in the products of agriculture. Quote, as soon as the labor of the husbandman produces more than his wants, he can, with this superfluity that nature records him as a pure gift over and above the wages of his toil, buy the labor of the other members of the society. The latter, in selling it to him, gain only their livelihood, but the husbandman gathers beyond his subsistence a wealth which is independent and disposable, which he has not bought and which he sells. He is therefore the sole source of the riches, which by their circulation animate all the labors of the society, because he is the only one whose labor produces over and above the wages of labor. End quote. In this first conception, we have to begin with the essence of surplus value, that it is value realized in sale without the seller having given up an equivalent for it, without his having bought it. Unpaid value. But in the second place, this is conceived as a pure gift of nature, this excess over the wage of labor, because after all it is a gift of nature. It depends on the productivity of nature that the laborer is able to produce in his day's labor more than is necessary for the reproduction of his labor power, more than the amount of his wages. In this first conception, the total product is still appropriated by the laborer himself, and this total product is divided into two parts. The first forms his wages. He is presented as his own wage laborer, who pays himself the part of the product that is necessary for the reproduction of his labor power, for his subsistence. The second part, which is the excess over the first, is a gift of nature, and forms surplus value. The nature of this surplus value, of this pure gift of nature, will however take clearer shape when the premise of the proprietor who cultivates his land is abandoned, and the two parts of the product, wages and surplus value, accrue to different classes, the one to the wage worker, the other to the landowner. The formation of a class of wage laborers, whether in manufacture or in agriculture itself, requires the separation of the conditions of labor from labor power, and the basis for this separation is that the land itself becomes the private property of one part of society, so that the other part is cut off from this objective condition for making use of its labor. Quote, in the early stages, there was no need to distinguish the proprietor from the cultivator. In this early time, as every industrious man would find as much land as he wished, he could not be tempted to work for others. But in the end, all land found its master, and those who could not have properties had at first no other resource than that of exchanging the labor of their arms in the employment of the stipendiary class, i.e. the class of artisans, of all non-agricultural laborers, for the superfluous portion of the produce of the cultivating proprietor. End quote. The cultivating proprietor, with the considerable surplus which the land gave to his labor, could, quote, pay men to cultivate his land, and for men who live on wages, it was as good to earn them in this business as in any other. Thus, ownership of land had to be separated from the labor of cultivation, and soon it was. The landowners began to shift the labor of cultivating the soil onto the wage laborers. End quote. In this way, therefore, the relation between capital and wage labor arises in agriculture itself. It first arises when a number of people find themselves cut off from ownership of the conditions of labor, above all from the land, and have nothing to sell but their labor itself. For the wage laborer, however, who can no longer produce commodities but must sell his labor itself, the minimum of wages, the equivalent of the necessary means of subsistence, necessarily becomes the law which governs his exchange with the owner of the conditions of labor. Quote, the mere workman, who has only his arms and his industry, has nothing unless he succeeds in selling his labor to others. In every kind of work, it cannot fail to happen, and as a matter of fact, it does happen, that the wages of the workman are limited to what is necessary to procure him his subsistence. End quote. Then, as soon as wage labor has arisen, quote, the produce of land is divided into two parts. The one includes the subsistence and the profits of the husbandman, which are the reward of his labor, and the condition upon which he undertakes to cultivate the field of the proprietor. What remains is that independent and disposable part which the land gives as pure gifts to him who cultivates it, over and above his advances and the wages of his trouble. And this is the portion of the proprietor, or the revenue with which the latter can live without labor, and which he uses as he will. End quote. This pure gift of the land, however, is now already defined as a gift which it gives to him who cultivates it, and thus as a gift which it makes to labor, as the productive power of labor applied to the land, a productive power which labor possesses through using the productive power of nature, and which it thus derives from the land. But it derives it from the land only as labor. In the hands of the landowner, therefore, the surplus appears no longer as a gift of nature, but as the appropriation, without an equivalent, of another's labor, which, through the productivity of nature, is enabled to produce means of subsistence in excess of its own needs, but which, because it is wage labor, is restricted to appropriating for itself, out of the product of the labor, only what is necessary to procure him, i.e. the worker, his subsistence. Quote, the cultivator produces his own wages, and, in addition, the revenue which serves to pay the whole class of artisans and other stipendiaries. The proprietor has nothing except through the labor of the cultivator, therefore not through a pure gift of nature. He receives from him his subsistence, and that wherewith he pays the labors of other stipendiaries. The cultivator has need of the proprietor only by virtue of conventions and laws. End quote. Thus, in this passage, surplus value is explicitly stated to be the part of the cultivator's labor which the proprietor appropriates to himself without giving any equivalent, and he sells the product of his labor, therefore, without having bought it. Only what Turgot has in mind is not exchange value as such, the labor time itself, but the surplus of products which the cultivator's labor supplies to the proprietor over and above his own wages. Which surplus of products, however, is only the embodiment of the amount of time which he works gratis for the proprietor, in addition to the time which he works for the reproduction of his wages. We see thus how within the limits of agricultural labor, the physiocrats have a correct grasp of surplus value. They see it as a product of the wage laborer's labor, although they in turn conceive this labor in the concrete forms in which it appears in use values. The capitalist exploitation of agriculture, leasing or letting of land, is, it may be noted in passing, described by Turgot as, quote, the most advantageous method of all, but it presupposes a land that is already rich, end quote. In considering surplus value, it is necessary to turn from the sphere of circulation to the sphere of production. That is to say, to deduce surplus value not simply from the exchange of commodity for commodity, but from exchange as it occurs within production, between the owners of the conditions of labor and the laborers themselves. These two confront each other as owners of commodities, and consequently, there is no assumption here of production independent of exchange. In the physiocratic system, the proprietors, or landowners, are the wage recipients, laborers and manufacturers in all other branches of industry being wage laborers or stipendiaries. Consequently, also the governing and the governed. Turgot analyzes the conditions of labor as follows, quote, in every craft, it is necessary that the workman should have tools in advance, that he should have a sufficient quantity of the materials upon which he has to labor. It is necessary that he should subsist while waiting for the sale of his finished goods. End quote. All these advances, these conditions on which alone labor can be performed, which are therefore preconditions of the labor process, are originally provided gratis by the land. It is the land which, quote, has provided the first fund of advances prior to all cultivation, end quote, in fruits, fish, game, etc., in tools such as tree branches, stones, in domestic animals, which multiply through the process of procreation, and moreover each year yields products in, quote, milk, fleeces, hides, and other materials, which, with the wood obtained in the forest, have formed the first fund for the works of industry, end quote. Now these conditions of labor, these advances to labor, become capital as soon as they have to be advanced to the laborer by a third person. And this is the case from the moment when the laborer owns nothing but his labor power itself. Quote, when a large part of the society had only their arms to maintain them, it was necessary that those who thus lived on wages should begin by having something in advance, either to procure the materials upon which to labor, or to maintain them while waiting for the payment of their wages. End quote. Turgot defines capitals as accumulated movable values. Originally, the proprietor or cultivator pays wages directly each day and supplies the material, for example, to the spinner of flax. As industry develops, larger advances and continuity of the process of production are necessary. This is then undertaken by the possessor of capital. In the price of his products, he must recover all his advances and a profit equal to, quote, what his money would have been worth to him if he had employed it in the purchase of an estate, end quote. Besides his wages, quote, for doubtless, if the profit were the same, he would have preferred to live without any exertion on the revenue of the land he could have acquired with the same capital, end quote. The stipendiary industrial class is itself subdivided, quote, into capitalists, entrepreneurs, and simple workers, end quote. Agricultural entrepreneurs are in the same position as these industrial entrepreneurs. They must similarly get all their advances replaced, along with the profit as shown above. Quote, all this must first be deducted from the price of the products of the earth. The surplus serves the cultivator for payment, the proprietor for the permission he has given him to make use of his field for setting his enterprise on foot. This is the price of the lease, the revenue of the proprietor, the net produce. For all the land produces, up to the amount that replaces the advances of every kind, and the profits of the person who has made the advances, cannot be regarded as a revenue, but only as the return of the expenses of cultivation. When one considers that, if the cultivator did not get them back, he would take care not to employ his resources and his toil in cultivating the field of another, end quote. Finally, quote, although capitals are partly formed by saving from the profits of the working classes, yet, as these profits always come from the earth, inasmuch as they are all paid either from the revenue or as part of the expenditure which serves to produce the revenue, it is evident that the capitals come from the land just as much as the revenue does, or rather that they are nothing but the accumulation of the part of the values produced by the land that the proprietors of the revenue, or those who share it with them, can lay by every year without using it, for the satisfaction of their wants, end quote. It is quite right that if rent is the only surplus value, accumulation takes place only from rent. What the capitalists accumulate apart from rent, they pinch from their wages, their revenue destined for their consumption, since this is how profit is defined. As profit, like wages, is reckoned in with the cost of cultivation, and only the surplus forms the revenue of the proprietor, the latter, in spite of the honorable status given him, is in fact excluded from the cost of cultivation, and thereby from being an agent of production, just as with the Ricardians. The emergence of the physiocrats was connected both with the opposition to Colbertism, and in particular with the hullabaloo over the John Law system. Section 4. Confusion of value with material substance. The confusion of value with material substance, or rather the equating of value with it, and the connection between this view and the whole outlook of the physiocrats, comes clearly to light in the following extracts from Ferdinando Pauletti. Quote, such a multiplication of matter, as are the products of the earth, has certainly never taken place through industry, nor is it possible. This gives matter only form, it only modifies it. Consequently, nothing is created by industry. But the objection may be raised. Industry gives matter form, and consequently it is productive. Even if this is not a production of matter, it is nevertheless one of form. Very well then, I won't contest this, but that is not the creation of wealth. On the contrary, it is nothing but an expense. Political economy presupposes and takes as the object of its investigation material and real production, which is found only in agriculture, since this alone multiplies the substances and products which form wealth. Industry buys raw materials from agriculture in order to work them up. Its labor, as we have already said, gives these raw materials only a form, but it adds nothing to them and does not multiply them. Give the cook a measure of peas with which he is to prepare your dinner. He will put them on the table for you, well cooked and well dished up, but in the same quantity as he was given. But on the other hand, give the same quantity to the gardener for him to put into the ground, he will return to you, when the right time has come, at least fourfold the quantity that he had been given. This is the true and only production. things receive value through the needs of men. Therefore, the value or the increase of value of commodities is not the result of industrial labor, but of the laborer's outlays. Hardly has a new manufacture of any kind made its appearance, but it immediately spreads within and outside the country. And see, very soon competition from other industrialists and merchants brings the price down to its correct level, which is determined by the value of the raw material and the cost of the laborer's maintenance." End quote. Section 5. Elements of Physiocratic Theory in Adam Smith. Agriculture is the first of all branches of industry to use the forces of nature on a considerable scale. Their use in manufacturing industry becomes apparent only at a higher stage of industrial development. The following quotation shows how, in this connection, Adam Smith still reflects the prehistory of large-scale industry, and for this reason upholds the physiocratic point of view, and how Ricardo answers him from the standpoint of modern industry. In Book 2, Chapter 5, of his An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith says, with reference to the rent of land, quote, "It is the work of nature which remains, after deducting or compensating everything which can be regarded as the work of man. It is seldom less than a fourth, and frequently more than a third, of the whole produce. No equal quantity of productive labor employed in manufactures can ever occasion so great a reproduction. In them, nature does nothing, man does all, and the reproduction must always be in proportion to the strength of the agents that occasion it." End quote. On which Ricardo comments in his On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, 2nd edition, published in 1819, quote, "Does nature nothing for man in manufactures? Are the powers of wind and water, which move our machinery and assist navigation, nothing? The pressure of the atmosphere and the elasticity of steam, which enables us to work the most stupendous engines, are they not gifts of nature? To say nothing of the effects of the matter of heat in softening and melting metals, of the decomposition of the atmosphere in the process of dyeing and fermentation. There is not a manufacture which can be mentioned in which nature does not give her assistance to man, and give it too generously and gratuitously." End quote. An anonymous author emphasizes that the physiocrats regarded profit as only a deduction from rent. For instance, quote, "Say they, of the price of a piece of lace, one part merely replaces what the laborer consumed, and the other part is only transferred from one man's pocket, i.e. that of the landlord's, to another's." End quote, from An Inquiry into Those Principles Respecting the Nature of Demand and the Necessity of Consumption, lately advocated by Mr. Malthus, published in London in 1821. The view of Adam Smith and his followers that the accumulation of capital is due to personal stinting and saving and self-denial of the capitalists also originates from the view of the physiocrats that profit, including interest, is merely revenue for the consumption of the capitalists. They could say this because they only regarded land rent as the true economic, so to speak legitimate, source of accumulation. Says Turgot, quote, "The husbandman is the only one whose labor produces over and above the wages of labor." End quote. Here, the entire profit is thus reckoned in with the wages of labor. Quote, "The cultivator creates over and above that restitution of his own wages, the revenue of the proprietor, and the artisan creates no revenue, either for himself or for others. All the land produces up to the amount that replaces the advances of every kind, and the profits of the person who has made the advances cannot be regarded as a revenue, but only as the return of the expenses of cultivation." Adolphe Blanqui says in his History of Political Economy, quote, "They were of the opinion that labor applied to the cultivation of the soil produced not only the wherewithal to maintain the laborer throughout the entire duration of the task, but also an excess of value, that is surplus value, which could be added to the mass of already existing wealth. They called this excess the net product. Thus they conceive surplus value in the form of the use values in which it appears. The net product had necessarily to belong to the owner of the land, and constituted in his hands a revenue fully at his disposal. What then was the net product of the other industries? Manufacturers, merchants, workmen, all were the employees, the stipendiaries of agriculture, sovereign creator, and dispenser of all wealth. The products of the labor of these latter represented in the system of the economists only the equivalent of what they had consumed during the task, so that after their work was completed, the sum total of wealth was absolutely the same as before, unless the workmen or the masters had placed in reserve, that is to say, saved, what they had the right to consume. Thus then, labor applied to the soil was the only labor productive of wealth, and labor in other industries was regarded as sterile because no increase in the general capital resulted from it. End quote. Thus the physiocrats saw the production of surplus value as the essence of capitalist production. It was this phenomenon that they had to explain, and it remained the problem after they had eliminated the profit upon alienation of the mercantile system. In order to acquire money, says Mercier de la Rivière, one must buy it, and after this purchase, one is no richer than one was before. One has simply received in money the same value that one has given in commodities. End quote from the natural and essential order of political societies. This holds good both for purchase and for sale, as also for the whole metamorphosis of the commodity, or for the result of the exchange of different commodities at their value, that is, the exchange of equivalents. Whence, therefore, comes surplus value, that is, whence comes capital. That was the problem for the physiocrats. Their error was that they confused the increase of material substance with the increase of exchange value. This increase of material substance, which, because of the natural processes of vegetation and generation, agriculture and stock raising, are distinguished from manufacture. Use value was their starting point, and the use value of all commodities, reduced, as the scholastics say, to a universal, was the material substance of nature as such, whose increase in the same form occurs only in agriculture. Germain Garnier, the translator of Adam Smith and himself a physiocrat, correctly expounds their theories of savings, etc. First, he says that manufacture, as the mercantilist maintained of all production, can only produce surplus value through the profit of expropriation, by selling commodities above their value, so that only a new distribution of values takes place, but no new addition to the created values. Quote, the labor of artisans and manufacturers, opening no new source of wealth, can only be profitable through advantageous exchanges, and has only a purely relative value, a value which will not be repeated if there is no longer the opportunity to gain on the exchanges. End quote from his translation of an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Or the savings which they make, the values which they secure over and above those which they expend, must be stinted from their own consumption. Quote, the labor of artisans and manufacturers, though only able to add to the general amount of the wealth of society, the savings made by the wage laborers and the capitalists, may well tend by these means to enrich society. End quote. And in greater detail, quote, the laborers in agriculture enrich the state by the very product of their labor. Laborers in manufacturers and commerce, on the contrary, cannot enrich it otherwise than through savings on their own consumption. This assertion of the economists is a consequence of the distinction which they have established and appears to be quite incontestable. Indeed, the labor of artisans and manufacturers cannot add anything else to the value of the material than the value of their own labor, that is to say, the value of the wages and profits which this labor should have earned at the rates actually current in the country for the one and the other. For these wages, whether they be small or large, are the reward of labor. They are what the laborer has the right to consume, and is presumed to consume, because it is only in consuming them that he can enjoy the fruits of his labor, and this enjoyment is all that in reality constitutes his reward. Similarly, profits, whether they be high or low, are also regarded as the daily and continuous consumption of the capitalist, who is naturally presumed to proportion his enjoyments to the revenue that his capital gives him. Thus, unless the workman curtails a part of the comforts to which he has the right, in accordance with the current rate of wages assigned to his labor, unless the capitalist resigns himself to saving a part of the revenue which his capital brings him, both the one and the other will consume, in proportion as the piece of work is completed, the whole value resulting from this work. The total quantity of the wealth of society will then be, after their labor is over, the same as it was before, unless they have saved a part of what they had the right to consume, and what they could consume without being charged with wasting, in which case the total quantity of the wealth of society will have been increased by the whole value of these savings. Consequently, it is correct to say that the agents of manufacture and commerce can only add to the total quantity of wealth existing in society by their privations alone. End quote. Garnier is also quite correct in noting that Adam Smith's theory of accumulation through savings rests on this physiocratic foundation. Adam Smith was strongly infected by the physiocrats, as he nowhere shows more strikingly than in his critique of the physiocrats. Garnier says, quote, finally, if the economists have maintained that manufacturing and commercial industry can only add to the national wealth by privations, Smith has likewise said that industry would be practiced in vain and the capital of a country would never grow larger unless the economy augmented it by its savings. Smith is therefore in full agreement with the economists, and so on. Section 6. The physiocrats as partisans of large-scale capitalist agriculture. Among the immediate historical circumstances which facilitated the spread of physiocratic theory and even its emergence, Adolphe Blanqui, in the work already mentioned, adduces, quote, "Of all the values which shot up in the feverish atmosphere of the system, that is, John Law's, nothing remained except ruin, desolation, and bankruptcy. Landed property alone did not go under in the storm. For this reason, Herr Proudhon, in Philosophy of Poverty, puts landed property only after credit. It even improved its position by changing hands and by being subdivided on a large scale, perhaps for the first time since feudalism. In particular, the innumerable changes of ownership which were effected under the influence of the system began the process of parceling out property. Landed property arose for the first time from the conditions of torpor in which the feudal system had kept it for so long. This was a real awakening for agriculture. The land passed now from out of a condition of mortmain and came into circulation." End quote. Turgot, as well as Quesnay and his other adherents, also want capitalist production in agriculture. Thus Turgot, quote, "The leasing or letting of land, this latter method, that is large-scale agriculture, based on the modern system of leases, is the most advantageous of all, but it presupposes a country that is already rich." End quote. And Quesnay, in his General Maxims of Economic Government of an Agricultural Kingdom, quote, "The pieces of land which are employed in growing grain should as far as possible be joined together in large-scale farms which can be managed by rich farmers, i.e. the capitalists, since the expenses for the maintenance and repair of the buildings are smaller, and therefore the costs are correspondingly much lower and the net product much greater in the case of large agricultural undertakings than in the case of small." End quote. In the same passage, Quesnay admits that the increased productivity of agricultural labor accrues to the net revenue, and therefore in the first place to the landowner, i.e. the owner of surplus value, and that the relative increase of the latter arises not from the land, but from the social and other arrangements for raising the productivity of labor. For he says in the same place, quote, "Every advantageous economy in labor, i.e. advantageous to the net product, which can be accomplished with the aid of animals, machines, water power, and so on, will be of benefit to the population." End quote. At the same time, Mercier de la Rivière has an inkling that surplus value, at least in manufacture, has something to do with the manufacturing workers. Turgot extended this to all production, as already mentioned. In the passage cited, he exclaims, quote, "Moderate your enthusiasm, ye blind admirers of the false products of industry. Before ye extol its miracles, open your eyes and see how many live in poverty, or at least in need, among those producers who understand the art of converting 20 sous into the value of 1,000 écus. Who then benefits by this enormous increase in value? What do you say? Comforts are unknown to those through whose hands it is accomplished. Take warning then by this contrast." End quote. Section 7. Contradictions in the political views of the physiocrats and the French Revolution. There were contradictions in the system of the economists, taken as a whole. Among others, Quesnay was for the absolute monarchy. Quote, "There must be only one supreme power. The system of opposing forces in a government is ruinous. It merely indicates discord among the great and the suppression of the small people." End quote from the above-mentioned General Maxims. Mercier de la Rivière says, quote, "By the very fact that man is intended to live in a community, he is intended to live under a despotism." End quote from the Natural and Essential Order of Political Societies. And to crown all, the friend of the people, the Marquis de Mirabeau the Elder. It was precisely this school, with its laissez-faire, laissez-aller, that overthrew Colbertism and all forms of government interference in the activities of bourgeois society. It allowed the state to live on only in the pores of this society, as Epicurus placed his gods in the pores of the world. The glorification of landed property in practice turns into the demand that taxes should be put exclusively on ground rent, and this implies the virtual confiscation of landed property by the state, just as with the radical section of the Ricardians. The French Revolution, in spite of the protests of Roederer and others, accepted this taxation theory. Turgot himself was the radical bourgeois minister who prepared the way for the French Revolution. For all their sham feudal pretenses, the physiocrats were working hand in hand with the encyclopedists. Turgot sought to anticipate the measures of the French Revolution. By the Edict of February 1776, he abolished the guilds. This edict was revoked 3 months after it was promulgated. Similarly, he annulled the road-making corvée des paysans. He tried to introduce the single tax on rent of land. We shall come back again later to the great service rendered by the physiocrats respecting the analysis of capital. Meanwhile, just this point. Surplus value, according to them, is due to the productivity of a special kind of labor, agricultural labor, and on the whole, this special productivity is due to nature itself. In the mercantile system, surplus value is only relative. What one wins, the other loses, profit upon alienation, or oscillation of the wealth between different parties, so that within a country, if we consider the total capital, no creation of surplus value in fact takes place. It can only arise in the relations between one nation and other nations, and the surplus realized by one nation as against the other takes the form of money, the balance of trade, because it is precisely money that is the direct and independent form of exchange value. In opposition to this, for the mercantile system in fact denies the creation of absolute surplus value, the physiocrats seek to explain absolute surplus value, the net product. And since the net product is fixed in their minds as use value, agriculture is for them the sole creator of it. Section 8. Vulgarization of the physiocratic doctrine by the Prussian reactionary Schmalz. One of the most naive representatives of the physiocratic theory, how far removed he is from Turgot, is the old smeller-out of demagogues and royal Russian privy councillor Schmalz. For instance, quote, if nature pays him, that is the lessor of land, the landowner, even double the legal interests, on what plausible ground could anyone dare to deprive him of it? The minimum of wages is so formulated by the physiocrats that the consumption or expenditure of the laborers is equal to the wage that they receive. Or, as Herr Schmalz puts it in a general way, quote, the average wage in a trade is equal to the average of what a man in this trade consumes during the time of his labor, end quote. Quote, rent of land is the one and only element of national revenue, and interest on capitals employed and the wages of all kinds of labors only make the product of this rent pass and circulate through everyone's hands. The utilization of the land, its faculty, its capacity for the annual reproduction of rent is all that constitutes the national wealth. If we go back to the foundations, to the first elements of the value of all objects, whatsoever they may be, we are forced to recognize that this value is nothing other than that of simple products of nature. That is to say, although labor may have given a new value to these objects and raised their price, this new value, or this price, is only made up, nevertheless, of the total values put together of all the natural products, which, because of the new form that labor has given them, have been destroyed, consumed, or used by the laborer in one way or another. This kind of labor, that is agriculture proper, being the only labor that contributes to the production of new bodies, it is therefore the only labor that can, up to a certain point, be considered productive. As for the labors in working up material or in industry, they simply give a new form to bodies which nature has produced. End quote. Section 9. An early critique of the superstition of the physiocrats in the question of agriculture. Quote from Very. All the phenomena of the universe, whether produced by the hands of man or through the universal laws of physics, are not actual new creations, but merely a modification of matter. Joining together and separating are the only elements which the human mind always finds on analyzing the concept of reproduction, and it is just the same with the reproduction of value and of wealth. When earth, air, and water in the fields are transformed into corn, or when the hand of man transforms the secretions of an insect into silk, or some pieces of metal are arranged to make the mechanism of a watch. Further, the physiocrats call the class of manufacturing laborers sterile, because, in their view, the value of manufactured products is equal to the raw material plus the means of subsistence which the manufacturing laborers consume during the time of manufacture. End quote. On the other hand, Very calls attention to the constant poverty of the agricultural population, in contrast to the progressive enrichment of the artisans, and then goes on to say, quote, this proves that the artisan, in the price which he receives, gets not only the replacement of his outlay on consumption, but a certain sum over and above that, and this sum is a new quantity of value created in annual production. The newly created value is therefore that part of the price of the agricultural or industrial products which they yield over and above the original value of the materials and the necessary outlays on consumption while they are being worked up. In agriculture, the seed and the consumption of the husbandman must be deducted, as in manufacture the raw material and the consumption of the industrial workman, and every year new value is created to the amount of the balance that remains, end quote. Chapter 3. Adam Smith. Section 1. Smith's two different definitions of value.
Okie doke. Well, we got to the end of that. Chapters 1 and 2 of Theories of Surplus Value, Karl Marx. This is from the audio book, which is included on the Medium page, and I hope you found that useful. I made some notes relative to that. I would say that this is important in the sense that the idea of figuring out what counts as surplus or a addition or a difference in value is pretty important. It's important to see how various people, physiocrats, Kane, among others, have tried to approach the problem. Needless to say, it's burdened by certain other presuppositions, the idea that you still needed an absolute monarchy, among other crazy kinds of things. But the underlying message here, of course, is how you think about what counts as additions. Are they savings? What counts as savings? What's the difference between savings and accumulation? And, these are may seem not that important, but the fact of the matter is we cannot reduce everything to elements like prices or wages. So there's a lot of details in here that we need to sort of think about, not the least of which is a reliance on the value of land, which changes, of course, with increasing details, nuances in the idea of capital. That is the difference of a capital improvement to the land itself, and then capital improvements that are things that are on the land, buildings, machines, etc. And then, of course, working out the difference between labor and labor power, um, not reducible necessarily to labor time, which is it has more details. And I think that by looking at the history of the concept, I think we begin to see explicated some of the details which, for some people, got lost in the onward movement of discussions of marginal utility. Um, the neoclassical and classical, lines of development are not necessarily, well, they are more correct from a abstract point of view in terms of math, but when we start introducing other concepts like, and it's not necessarily mentioned here, but a concept of, for example, equilibrium, um, we can see that there's further details that need to be worked out. Noting, of course, that there seem to be no questions. I will stop the share and stop the live stream. Thank you very much for your attention. We will continue next Saturday on chapter 3 of There is a Surplus Value by Karl Marx. These are the reason why we're doing this is because it still needs to be done at some moment, is to review that material and see it sort of in context, since it does provide a kind of as they say, historical critical relation to Volume 1 of Capital, which will be tomorrow. Um, and as my little recollection is chapters 18 and 19 um, in in Capital Volume 1, the 2024 version. Thank you then again for your attention.